Welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is Scott Klein, and I am the director of the center this year. As many of you know, this is the 25th anniversary of the center, and in honor or in memory or whatever we do when we do these kinds of things, to mark this milestone, we've actually asked a number of previous directors to return, and so I want to extend a special welcome to them. And I'm going to try to embarrass them as much as I can here very quickly. So we have John Tice joining us. John was a director in the 90s, if I believe, if I remember right. John has returned. We also have Doug Letson. Where is Doug? Doug is over here. He acted as an interim director right after he stepped down as president. Who knew you took on more responsibilities after you quit being president? But I guess that's something you do. We also have Megan Shore with us. Sitting in the front row. She would be the best looking one of all of the group. She also happens to be my wife. She does, actually. And then we have the ugliest of them all, David Seljak. He's up here wearing his newest suit, and I've actually asked David to introduce our speaker tonight, one of the former directors of the center, Dr. Michael W. Higgins. Who is currently the president of St. Thomas University and the former, he's got a lot of titles, and the former president and vice chancellor of St. Jerome's University, as well as dean, chair of religious studies, and chief bottle washer, or whatever he was when he was here. So I want to welcome all of you. I think it's going to be a wonderful evening, a wonderful celebration. We put together an incredible lineup, I think, this year. To commemorate just 25 years, and I look forward to seeing a number of you throughout the season. It is truly wonderful to see old friends, some new faces, a number of students. So if you ever want to just break into a chat at the end of the lecture, I'm sure that's what we do right here, so feel free to do that. I do have a little PowerPoint presentation to introduce not just the evening, but the entire lecture series this year, because again, it is the 25th anniversary. So I'm going to make an attempt here not to fall over myself and move through some of this rather quickly, so David can give you the lecture. Just a little bit about the center. Well, it did begin 25 years ago, and what you have up here is the original brochure. This is something that Michael put together when he arrived here at St. Jerome's in 1982. I hope you remember that, Michael. Yeah. So you will notice that that is Michael with some hair and with a beard that's fully black. One of the things I do want you to know, you can't see it very well here, but in the original brochure, Michael laid out the directive of the center. And while Michael takes a lot of the credit, the actual idea for a lot of this comes from Father Norm Choate, who is also here. Father Norm is the best dressed of all. And again, the mission statement is one that's been with us for the last 25 years, and I just highlighted a bit of it here. The center is a broadly based ecumenical effort deeply rooted in the Catholic tradition and concerned with issues of spirituality and justice. And I can say that looking over the history of this center and the center lectures, this was truly visionary, and we've, in some respects, really stayed true to that vision. Where did we begin? Well, it was in this room. Here you have Michael beginning things off. I believe this was probably a Merton conference. There were many Merton conferences in the beginning. Michael was working on a book on Merton, so let's keep that. Another Merton conference. Some of you know Gregory Baum. He's been one of our frequent speakers here. What you're seeing here is that almost immediately the people that Michael brought in were truly really heroes of the faith, people who were vanguards in many respects regarding spirituality and social justice. So we had a bar set very high in the center, and I'm not sure all of us are living up to it, so you set it too high, Michael. Okay. So we've had lectures that challenge us. We've had lectures, again, with Gregory, and here I think Michael's actually challenging Gregory, which is quite an astonishing fact. We had Father Bill Ryan in 1998, and he has been one of our frequent lecturers here as well. We had Stan McKay here in 2005, and Stan was speaking to us about indigenous issues in Christianity and the role of Christian social justice movements in the North. We've had people like James Loney, who was a part of the Christian peacemaker teams and was held hostage in Iraq. So you can see we've had a very diverse group of people who would challenge us. I think this is probably the best picture in all of our archives. This is Sister Joan Chittister going at us. So I don't think Michael's planning on doing that tonight, at least I hope not. Okay? We've also had lectures that teach us, pastoral and otherwise. Margaret Heppelthwaite was here in 1993, gave a very memorable lecture from what I've heard. Had a tremendous impact on the center and the University of Hull. We had John Della Costa back when Doug was the director in 2003, acting as intern when David moved away for a sabbatical. We've had Father John Pugente in 1996. Other people we've had, Bishop Terence Pendergast in 1998. We've had lectures that lead us. Gerard Peltier in 1990. As many of you know, Gerard has since passed away in 1997, giving a very memorable lecture about the public role of faith. Here you have David and Claude Ryan. Claude has also passed away. Again, these are I know talking to David when I first came here in 2002, this was one of the most memorable things I know in David's life, and Claude Ryan had a very profound impact on the way David envisions the center, in fact. So, other lectures we've had, people that inspire us, lectures that inspire. Karen Armstrong was here in 2004 talking about her experiences as a young Catholic woman, as a scholar who failed her PhD thesis and how she recovered from this after periods of depression. We've had these people, I don't know who these people are, the Bach Tade singers in 1996, and can you spot Michael? He would be the tallest one in the back row. Okay? Yeah, we've also had a number of vocalists here. We've had 5 on the floor, but if you can count them, there's only 4. They're Mennonites. I don't know if Mennonites can count, or they, one of them got scared because they're coming to a Catholic institution. Only 4 of the 5 showed up, but they had a wonderful time. We had Sister Helen Prejean here in 1998, and there were roughly 1,000 people packed into this room to hear Sister Helen talk about her experiences dealing with capital punishment in the United States. Jean Vanier was here in 2001, inspiring us to move forward. And what all of these lectures have done, they've helped us recognize the importance of community. Here's Bill Brown. I don't know if Bill's here tonight, by chance, maybe. Importance of community in doing justice. This is one of our students in the Beyond Borders program in Ghana. Okay, so basically what this program, what this lecture series is about, is not simply just hearing, but it's also about doing. I know a lot of us we leave these lectures and we begin to make profound impacts in our community. So the center has been, I think, an invaluable encouragement in that respect. And so if you would join me in thanking all of the directors in doing this. This is my first gig as director, so you can't thank me yet. But I'd also like to thank our donors, our lecture donors, who support the lectures, who through endowments and otherwise, and you can see some of their names up here. And I think most importantly, I'd like to thank the center community. And truly, we look forward to working with you over the next 25 years to promote a socially engaged faith and to work toward a more just world. And I really hope that we do this in solidarity together as we journey through this life together. So, I don't know if you can promise all that tonight, Michael, but give it a shot. I would like to ask David Seljak to come up and introduce Michael. I suspect that David knows Michael longer than anybody continuously at St. Jerome now, possibly. So I'll ask David to come up.
It's true that I met Michael in 1974, I believe. He was a grade 11 English teacher at St. Michael's College School while he was doing his doctorate, and I was his English student, and neither one of us has recovered from the encounter in the past 33 I am honored to be introducing my friend and one-time boss, one-time teacher, Michael W. Higgins, to give the inaugural Michael W. Higgins lecture at the St. Jerome's Center for Catholic Experience, whose first director was Michael W. Higgins. Funds for the Michael W. Higgins lecture were raised when Michael W. Higgins left St. Jerome's University. Thus, it is fitting that the topic for the first Michael W. Higgins lecture delivered by Michael W. Higgins should be Michael W. Higgins. At least that's what I'm assuming, given the title of tonight's talk. It's not easy being God. When I first heard the title, I emailed Michael directly and said, "Geez, Michael, get over yourself. You're only the president of St. Thomas University." At St. Jerome's, we knew Michael was not God, and we used to tell a joke about the difference between Michael and God. God, we said, was everywhere. Michael was everywhere except St. Jerome's University. I think the title to this introduction is, "It's Not Easy Being Michael W. Higgins," at least not with friends like me. As people might recall, Michael and I had a great tradition of ending the St. Jerome Center lectures, whether they be learned theological discourses by noted theologians or provocative talks by a former prime minister, with laughter. I would insult Michael, and then he would publicly fire me. By Monday morning, bygones would be bygones, and the cycle of abuse would continue. One occasion stands out in my memory. Former Reform Party leader Preston Manning gave a talk on politics and faith, quite a good talk actually, and Michael had met Mr. Manning in a reading club held at the University of Toronto's Massey College. When Mr. Manning concluded his talk, I came to the podium to introduce Michael so that Michael would thank the speaker, and that was our tradition. And that evening I said, and I quote, "When I learned that Michael was in a book club with Preston Manning, I said to him that it must have been disconcerting and even intimidating to meet a man of such political power and historical importance." And Michael replied that no doubt it was, but he felt that Mr. Manning had held up rather well and showed no signs of nervousness. Telling that story reminds me that we have a new president of St. Jerome's University in the room. Dr. David Perrin is here for his first appearance at the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. So, David, please stand and let us welcome you to St. Jerome's. In searching for a new president, of course, St. Jerome's had set the highest standards. And as it did in the search that led to the selection of Michael Higgins some 10 years ago, it is clear that the St. Jerome's community has postponed, perhaps for another decade, its long-held dream of a president who exceeds the height requirements for the roller coaster at Canada's Wonderland. I'm thinking that the next search committee's got to have a sign. You must be this tall to be president of St. Jerome's. Seriously, though, my introduction of Michael. I knew I was going to get around to this. Michael Higgins is president and vice chancellor of St. Thomas University, a dynamic and thriving independent Roman Catholic institution of higher learning that was tragically, just 2 weeks ago, eaten by beavers. The old jokes are the best. He was, between 1997 and 2004, president and vice chancellor of St. Jerome's. He was professor of English and religious studies and author and co-author of numerous books and articles. His most recent work is Stalking the Holy in Pursuit of Saint-Making, published by Anansi. Of course, we all recall his award-winning book, Heretic Blood, which was also the subject of a St. Jerome's lecture, like Stalking the Holy, called Heretic Blood, The Spiritual Geography of Thomas Merton, a book that's been translated into many languages. He is also published with Dr. Doug Letson, a former president of St. Jerome's, who's here tonight, The Jesuit Mystique, My Father's Business, a biography of His Eminence, G.M. Cardinal Carter, and a national bestseller, Power and Peril, The Catholic Church at the Crossroads. He is a CBC radio documentarist with over 50 scripts and a columnist for the Toronto Star since 1986. Thomas Wolfe may have written, "You can't go home again," but Michael, we are glad that you have come home again, because wherever you go, St. Jerome's is still your home. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome home Dr. Michael. Dr. W. Michael Higgins.
I would like to ask Father Perrin if he would go halves with me on a hitman for... Good, we're on the same page. It's a pleasure to be here as the second best-looking director in the history of the St. Jerome Center. And I noticed that Scott encouraged you to break out and have a chat with each other. I'd like to exhort you not to consider such an activity until the lecture is completed. It is generally a pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to be giving the Michael W. Higgins lecture, but I can tell you in all honesty it would have been a pleasure to be back to giving the David Seljack lecture, or indeed any other kind of lecture, because it is a pleasure to come home. St. Jerome's has been a central and powerful force in the shaping of my life and that of my wife, and indeed of our children. And it is a pleasure to come back, a sign of the fact that St. Jerome's is still very much with me, to the eternal consternation, I think, of my new faculty and community and the local parliamentarians. Not infrequently, when I'm in public and even on the CBC, refer to St. Jerome's University when I mean St. Thomas. So it's going to take a little while. There are a lot of New Brunswickers who hate St. Jerome's and they don't even know where it is. So once again, I've added considerably to national unity. But it's not national unity, St. Jerome's or St. Thomas that I'm going to be talking about, nor, contrary to David's jest, myself. It is, in fact, the other fellow who goes by the name of God. And it is about the divinity's bloody bad luck these days, because it isn't fun being God. How did this happen? And what are the social and cultural and media forces that contribute to the growth of a virulent and very self-confident and unrelenting atheism? These just don't crop out of nowhere. There are all kinds of reasons for it, and tonight I want to examine some of them. This isn't necessarily a vigorous defense of religion over against atheism, nor is it a desire to dispute the grounds of a legitimate atheistic position. It is rather to try and understand what is happening in our culture. And some of it is really quite seismic in its implications, and some of it is rather bonkers. Let me start with the bonkers part. Just recently, a senator in the state of Nebraska has formally launched a lawsuit against God. The senator has been deeply angered by terroristic threats against himself and his constituents, inspired fear and caused widespread death and destruction and terror on earth to millions and millions. As a consequence, he's launched a major lawsuit seeking a permanent injunction against the Almighty. Now, this may say something about the state of Nebraska. It may say something about American jurisprudence, or it may say something about God's bad luck these days. And it is something along those lines that I want to talk for the next little while. And I'm going to break it up in small parts, largely so we can get through to Advent, but also because it's more convenient to keep the pages in order. Number one, I want to talk about the fact that for many people, religion actually enrages. Seems like a strange thing to say, when you often think of prayer and religion as something that inspires, that gives us hope and whatnot, that for some people the primal impulse seems to be rage, outrage. How did this happen? Let me give you an example. Currently, I'm the only Canadian who, and there are probably various reasons for this, who sit as an honorary contributor to Commonweal magazine in New York as an official blogger. Well, this wasn't an easy thing for me to do because I don't take to technology very easily. So it's taken me about a year to figure out how to do this. But what I have discovered is that when I put a comment on talking about the faith of Conrad Black, okay, not defending Conrad Black, but talking about it as constitutive of meaning for him. How do you understand what motivates somebody? It generated such a reaction among the Americans that I was practically blown off the screen. People suggesting to me that do I often comment at cocktail parties about Hitler being baptized? Would I be in favor of resurrecting Somoza in the interests of the church? And I realized then the disproportionate, indeed rage that was filtering through with this made me understand perhaps a little better than I had before the intensity of the cultural wars that you have in the United States, but how also religion itself becomes just the button you push when you want to get people riled. For instance, the ongoing prophet problem with the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, you will recall the controversy in Denmark. Well, recently it surfaced again, this time deliberately and in Sweden. Here's the note. A leading Swedish newspaper yesterday said the country would not apologize for the recent publication of a Prophet Muhammad cartoon that has inflamed devout Muslims around the world. The editorial said, Sweden has a duty from now on to defend its principles and present an open dialogue. It said offended Muslims would not receive the apologies they are asking for. Swedish newspaper Nerikes Allehanda published a cartoon on August the 18th depicting the Prophet Muhammad as a dog. A month earlier, Rick Salutin, one of the sanest voices in the Globe and Mail, and the only left-leaning voice in the Globe and Mail, in his column said in a point of some pique and frustration, and consider this genuine bona fide leftist is a former rabbinical seminarian, Salutin said the following: 40 years ago, God was dead, according to newspaper magazines at least, and religion was an inert force in public affairs. Now, it won't go away. It's an annoying part of everyday news. Tony Blair's final trip as British leader was to the Pope, so he could telegraph his plan to convert. His successor, Gordon Brown, is described as a different kind of believer, sober, social, Christian, in order to explain his response to this week's terrorism scare. And George W. Bush is an end-timer who encodes millenarian references in speeches. He says, for instance, freedom is not America's gift to the world. It is the Almighty God's gift to every man and woman in this world. As for Stephen Harper, the news, said Lawrence Martin, that's Chrétien's biographer, this week, is that he doesn't include his religiosity in his overt presentation, and that's just on our side, end of quote. Quite independent of the fact that Salutin uses, like many posters and social scientists, the term religiosity in a pejorative way. The term actually is pejorative. And what often happens is you'll see with posters and many others, they gauge or try to determine a quotient of religiosity. What they don't mean religiosity. Religiosity is a form of sentimental religion. What you're trying to do is ascertain the level of conviction, commitment, understanding, that kind of thing. Religiosity does not mean that, but that's what it's come to mean in general parlance with our journalists. Perhaps the most vicious statement, still in this section on God and religion enraging, is a very interesting piece by Joanna Schneller, who is married to Ian Brown, and so a prominent figure in the Globe industry, and a film critic in her own right. Not the finest film critic, in my view. She's quite a few leagues behind Rick Groen and Liam Lacey, but nonetheless, she's there, and she says the following about a recent gathering at the Toronto Film Festival. Watch the language here, watch its brazenness, and try to remember its like in recent decades. The issue of violence and religion came up at the Ryerson Theatre on Sunday during the discussion between Bill Maher and Larry Charles. You remember Larry Charles? He's the bearded and behatted writer and or director of Borat, Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, and Entourage. They came to town with clips of their documentary in progress, Religulous, which details the absurdities they see in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Americans are now one of the leading torturers in the world, Maher said, and the government is run almost exclusively by people of faith. Now, he's not in satirical mode, okay? Satire is one thing. This isn't the satirical mode. It's amazing to me how many evangelical Christians are okay with torture, considering how their boy got tortured so bad. But their Christianity isn't about morals or ethics. It's about saving their ass. They pray to Christ so that they can do whatever they want in this world, and he'll forgive them and protect them in the next. That's ass backwards. Sounds a bit like a proctologist. All these religions believe in end times, so there's no need to believe in peace or working things out, said Charles. We don't need a person of faith in the U.S. presidency. We need a person of doubt. We need a person who says, I don't know what will happen if we invade Iraq. Let's think about that. We have a person of faith, and it's a mess. End of quote. Now, I think we all know there's some considerable measure of truth to that. But in the process, what else has he succeeded in doing with his grand generalization? One might want to recall that Jimmy Carter is a person of faith. One might want to recall that many of those in the judiciary, many of those who are political activists, and many of those who have worked either inside or outside the Republican fold are in fact genuine people of faith. The caricature becomes normative. The caricature becomes dogmatic truth. The caricature becomes unassailable. And that's when the problem begins. And that's why it's tough being God, because you can't win. What happens is the caricature, the stereotype, the derivative, the easy way out becomes the norm. Look at Canada, and as a final instance of the religion in raging. Jean Charest established the Commission on Reasonable Accommodation. This is as the result of problems, as you know, with the Hasidim in Montreal, who objected to the presence of a YWCA next door to the synagogue. And they requested that the glass be frosted so that those in prayer, particularly the young, wouldn't be tempted by watching women exercise. This was followed not too slowly afterwards, or in a long time afterwards, by various instances around the niqab and, of course, the burqa. Within a short period of time, with growing tension, issues around who can wear the niqab and play volleyball or football, well, maybe not football, but tennis and all the other individual sports, the situation began to unravel. Charest appointed a commission. On the commission, he appointed a distinguished sociologist, Gérard Bouchard, who is in fact Lucien Bouchard's brother, and perhaps, I think inarguably, the foremost public intellectual in Canada, and one of the finest political philosophers in North America, Charles Taylor, to sit on this commission to try to find some measure of accommodation. What is interesting in both cases is that these are not businessmen, they are not politicians, they are not diplomats, they're thinkers. He went to the academy to find a way to find a solution to a problem that seems intractable. You will note, if you read it in the papers or watch on television, that various of these commission hearings, because they are going on throughout the province, have been nothing short of incendiary. Violent language, bias expressed without any kind of constraint, efforts on the behalf of the chairs to try to bring some order. In short, it has generated enormous emotional response. Charest has a problem on his hands, but not just Charest. So why is it then that religion enrages? How have we come to this? Or is it in the nature of the beast? Well, one of the things that we can see that is symptomatic of this excess of society's satiety, its exhaustion with this, its annoyance, is the growth in books that showcase religion in a particularly negative way, and the particular industry that we now have with atheists, writing strongly aggressive, indeed vituperative books. Now, I have some sympathy for the atheists. We used to burn them. Okay? I mean, everybody's getting somewhat self-righteous about this. They're getting, look at these atheists. No respect for us people of faith. Not that long ago, if you were an atheist, that was a sure ticket to oblivion. And you were certainly in a situation where your atheism was very often kept secret. In fact, you could be accused of being an atheist for all kinds of things, denying God being one of the least of them. So now it seems as if they have license. They've come of age. They're not frightened anymore. Religion is in retreat. These books are legion. Their voices simply cannot be stilled. And they have an audience that appears to be growing. They are the new atheists. Philosopher Roger Scruton calls them the evangelical atheists because they're hell-bent on converting you. Okay? There may be no hell, but damn it, they're going to get you. Look at Richard Dawkins and the God delusion. In fact, there is a website right now existing in Britain where people are raising money to send a copy of Richard Dawkins book, The God Delusion, to every MP. So convinced are they that his arguments have only to be read to be accepted. And a great number of the members of Parliament of Great Britain spent their holiday in Blackpool and elsewhere carrying the tome of Richard Dawkins called The God Delusion. American Sam Harris and his Letter to a Christian Nation, in which he claims, among other things, and I quote, that raising children to believe they are members of a religious group is a ludicrous obscenity, had in his earlier work, The End of the Faith, argued that he was the first of the atheistic spate of books. The French philosophe Michel Onfray, in his Defense of Atheism, makes a very strong case, but it, of course, is all rhetoric. Wonderfully conceived and delivered rhetoric, but all rhetoric nonetheless. In fact, John Cornwall, who chairs at the Religion and Science Project at Jesus College at Cambridge, in reviewing the latest book on Darwin, makes a very interesting observation about Darwin that cuts to the heart of Dawkins' book, Dennett's book, and many of the others who are using Darwin to advance their case for modern atheism. Here's what Cornwall says. The practice of appropriating Darwin in support of reductionist and naturalist agendas and ideologies started in Darwin's own day, spawning generations of racist notions of human societies. He was also pressed into service as the promoting prophet of atheism during his own lifetime. Yet for all his latter-day skepticism, at no time did Darwin suggest, privately or publicly, that religious belief was incompatible with the scientific imagination, nor did he judge religious believers to be contemptible or dangerous. And that's one of the differences. The new atheists aren't out simply to disprove God's existence. They are out to ridicule his believers in God. There are no lines drawn. There is no quarter allowed. There is, in fact, it's a license to show no pity and to ridicule without any kind of fear that somehow or other this would be either indecorous or unjust. It's fair game. And perhaps the most excellent specimen of this, of course, is the pièce de résistance, Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. I don't know if you've seen the book, but it's wonderfully conceived by the designers. We have God is Not Great, and it's very small print. The absolute opposite of what you would expect. And what is interesting here is at the very opening of this, Hitchens observes, as I write these words, conscious of the work of George Orwell's 1941 essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, people of faith are in their different ways planning your and my destruction, and the destruction of all the hard-won human attainments that I have touched upon. And here's the point. Religion poisons everything. End of quote. You see, it's not a matter of suggesting in any way that a religious point of view, arguably advanced or defended or intuited or articulated in however manner, as a legitimate option to a way of living, as something that is constitutive of one's self-definition. It's not that. It's that religion, in all its manifestations, poisons everything it touches, so that the human and social fabric is damaged by religion, that faith is not just a childish fantasy, kind of period of nonsense that will pass with maturity, but something that corrodes the mind and culture. In other words, the best thing that could happen to religion would be to extirpate it, to destroy it. Now, interestingly, Anthony Gottlieb, a writer, an American writer, says in The New Yorker, in a wonderfully clever essay called Atheist with Attitude, he says the following: since all the arguments against belief have been widely publicized for a long time, and they have been known for a long time, there's nothing in the new arguments, with a couple of rare exceptions in relation to some hypotheses on some biochemical evolutionary possibilities. Other than that, these arguments are cleverly rehearsed rhetorical arguments that originated largely in the 18th and 19th century. But he says all the arguments against belief have been widely publicized for a long time. Today's militant atheists must sometimes wonder why religion persists. Why is it still here? Hitchens says that it is born of fear and probably ineradicable. Harris holds that there are genuine spiritual experiences, having kicked sand in the faces of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He dives headlong into the surf of Eastern spirituality, encouraging readers to try Buddhist techniques of meditation instead of dangerous creeds. Dennett, one of the strongest of the evolutionary school, in most of his book, argues that religion may have arisen in various ways through an evolutionary context, and its ideas spread, but it's thin stuff. And these are early days for a biological account of religion. It may, however, be too late for one. If a propensity toward religious belief is hardwired in the brain, as it is sometimes said to be, the wiring has evidently become frayed. This is especially true in rich countries, nearly all of which, Ireland and America, exceptions, have relatively high rates of unbelief. Well, go to Ireland. There are changes there too. Things are unfolding in many different ways. And why? Why this aggression? Why the anger? And is it really anger against God? Or is it a shibboleth? Is it a chimerical thing? Well, let me just look at a couple of these things statistically. The top 50 best-selling nonfiction books that I managed to amass from some information from June the 6th to August the 1st, 2007, would indicate some relief. There are 50 books, and of those, only 1, 2, 3, 4 of them are actually books about religion. But they're right up there at the top. Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali's Infidel, which is enjoying enormous currency. One other book makes it into it, though. In fact, he's in the top 13. In fact, he's number 13, which I'm sure doesn't amuse him. And that's Pope Benedict XVI. His book, Jesus of Nazareth, has actually managed to make it on the bestseller lists. But all these books, Infidel, The Future of Religion, God Hates Fags, The Rhetorics of Religious Violence, a new book that came out that is causing great controversy in Toronto. It's written by an English professor in Toronto, but talks out of his American experience, and yet the review of the book in Books in Canada was by not a compatriot, but a colleague of his, who was arguing that it's not so much the problem of God speak, the way Americans understand rhetoric in relation to sexuality and judgment, but perhaps he should get the more inspired Canadian notion, which is to suggest that the problem is God. Very interesting book. Also in Books in Canada and this is what I found really fascinating, because once you penetrate beyond the rhetoric, you begin to discover many other things happening. A fascinating series of reviews of books, poetry books, that are books by ostensibly religious poets. 2 or 3 guitars, selected poems by John Terpstra. A.F. Moritz, probably one of the finest intellectual poets emerging in Canada, whose new book, Now That You Revive, has been reviewed. And a review by Richard Green of a collection of poets from the Maritimes by Anne Compton. Green actually is a Catholic poet teaching at the University of Toronto, whose first poetry, when he got back from Oxford, was actually published by Grail, a journal published by St. Jerome for 14 years. These poets are there. There are people doing the hard thinking, but they don't have the theater. They don't have the stage. The larger choreography is being set by others, and the rage continues. Maclean's magazine had a full profile, the magazine cover, and a good deal of its insert. And this is from a magazine which is primarily God-friendly, by the way. Maclean's magazine is as a national magazine, particularly under its current iteration under Ken White, represents a fairly strong conservative sensitivity and support for theological language and issues, at least of a certain iteration. But this essay, called Is God Poison? A New Movement Blames God for Every Social Problem from Darfur to Child Abuse, was actually written by a medievalist, Brian Bethune. Brian's been really fair in trying to assess it. He does, as a reporter does, provides the information and allows an enlightened reader to draw the necessary conclusions. But the climate is such, why would you even ask that question? Is God poison? Not is God dead. In the 60s, God was dead. Okay? We had books about it, several of them, usually written by theologians and bishops. Precisely the people who are in the trade of keeping God resuscitated. Time magazine, for the first time in its history, had no photograph on its cover, simply God is dead, in the 1960s. It created a whole school of thought. People like Robinson and Van Buren and Hamilton and Altizer were all very much part of that whole death of God movement. But God is poison is different. This is a different shift. It's a different cipher of cultural displacement and human alienation. Something isn't right. Martin Levin, some of you may know him, he's the books editor of the Globe and Mail, and he writes a column called Shelf Life, and one of them was simply called Godless. I'm just going to read this small excerpt for you because it reflects, I think, quite nicely the dilemma of an enlightened struggler into faith. Though I enjoy a good polemic as much as the next fellow, and have spent many an enjoyably discomfited hour toiling in the science versus religion vineyard, I tend to find these books, all the ones I've been listing, not quite filling intellectually. In their own way, homiletic, they are preaching to the converted. Virtually no person of faith will be convinced to abandon his beliefs. Of course, few such persons are likely to pick up any of these books to begin with. And none deals adequately with atheism and the city or with the persistence of ritual. As skeptical as I am of religion's claims, as dubious as I find its superstitions, as much as I think it should enjoy no special status sheltering it from criticism or even ridicule, I remain as skeptical that the mysteries of the universe, that it exists at all is one, will be revealed to science any time soon, if ever. End of quote. Now that more humble, tentative, skeptical, intellectually respectful and exploratory approach stands in sharp contrast to the screeds that denounce religion and what I think is far more dangerous, those who hold religious belief. To attack a system is one thing. To attack those who hold that system as having meaning in their lives, as credulous, stupid, malfunctioning, dysfunctional, or anything like that, is to slip very quickly and very dangerously into creating a culture of hostility and persecution. Contrast this remark by Martin Levin with the rather supercilious, arch, and intellectually deficient argument that was advanced by one of his contemporaries, Russell Smith. Now, Smith isn't a bad culture critic, and he does some interesting things in his own writing, but he's one of these people that knows absolutely nothing about religion at all. But that doesn't prevent him from talking about it. In fact, there's no natural humility, the kind of humility you saw in evidence with David and myself earlier on. None of that is here. He doesn't understand religion at all. He understands spirituality even less, and that's particularly problematic. He says at one point that, talking about people of faith, he says, is it really bad to have all these people with all their superstitions? If they make people healthier, what's wrong with them? There are a lot less dangerous talk of infidels and heretics. Well, I'm not sure about that. I wish Hitchens had turned his caustic anger against the moderate as well as the extreme. Personally, I feel unsafe among any people who believe in magic. They might turn around at any moment and dismiss science and reason in any discussion. The spiritual is always a trump card, an instant argument ender, and I'm afraid that nothing has changed. Religions disappear, but new ones, like disease, always replace them. Now, how is that at all an understanding of religion, of what it means, of how it contributes to the genius of a Mozart, to the great architectonic thinking of an Aquinas, the brilliant poetry of a Dante, the great art of a Buonarroti, to name just a few of the countless numbers of artists and intellectuals and scientists throughout the centuries for whom this wasn't a simple act of easy credulousness. It's remarkable. The hubris is stunning. The license to say nonsense seems unchecked. But what explains it? Just a new arrogance? I don't think so. I think in great measure it's religion's own fault. Because what people see is the ugly face of religion. They see on a daily basis its capacity for terror, the honor killings that are not uncommon, the violence in the Netherlands. William Dalrymple, in an interesting article in the New Yorker called Days of Rage, letter from Pakistan, about human rights lawyer Asma Janagir, put it rather nicely. He interviewed her, and this is what she says, speaking of honor killings. Honor killings are not specifically Islamic tradition. They are just a bad tradition that must be stopped. Before Zia came to power, honor killings were restricted mainly to Pakistan's tribal regions and other remote areas, but the practice has since spread to the rest of the country and is now widely seen as something linked with religion as well as with the old notions of tribal honor. I was born a Muslim, says this remarkable woman and extraordinary lawyer. I was born a Muslim, and that is still my identity. Islam is no more violent or fanatical than any other religion. It's just that many Muslim countries have politicized religion for the benefit of the rulers. There are Christian fanatics and Hindu fanatics too. Put a gun in the hands of any of them and they will terrorize people. Religion, in my view, should in the end be something personal. It should not be a concern of the state, and no religion has the right to degrade women or erode their human dignity. I always ask these Islamists, what kind of justice do you want? Give me specifics. Look how selectively Sharia law is applied here. When Zia started his Islamization, it was aimed first at women, non-Muslims, and the poor. That served his purpose. It is never invoked against the elite. We've never had an Islamic banking system here, for example. The poor understand this. I remember one woman in jail telling me, if there is a God, it's a God of the rich people. This is not about faith. None of this. It is about political strategies. What is true in Pakistan is equally true in the United States. Equally true in Canada, when we have the courage to have these debates in public and don't put them on the periphery. It's true when we avoid the easy insults and exchanges that prevent us from entering into substantive argument. I was looking at a series, in a matter of just 3 days, just following in 3 days in the paper, headlines by Irshad Manji, John Ibbotson, and Lawrence Martin. And in almost every instance, they got it wrong. They got it wrong not because they're far from conversant with religious issues, but because they subsume that knowledge to a larger rhetorical intent. Religion's capacity to divide, its capacity to sow division, its capacity to foment disharmony is considerable. But it is also considerable and considerably wrong to conclude that all this can be easily passed off to a Republican White House, right, or to theological troglodytes of whatever persuasion exercising power in whatever venue, or indeed to various forces in society fearful of change, who rely on a millenarian notion of civilization's imminent demise as some kind of cheap compensation for their own misery. That's not religion. That is fear. It is a distortion, a manipulation of religion. It is a form of religion no poet, no mystic, no saint, no holy man or holy woman could ever identify as a life-giving force that defines their life and meaning. Earlier on, in a wonderful sequence of visuals. Scott provided us with an instance of the various and several people that have come here. Helen Préjean and Jean Vanier and Margaret Hebblethwaite, working with the poor in Santa Maria outside of Asunción in Paraguay, the absolutely most desperate of poor. And she's suffused with joy, and there is no hatred, and there's no violence in her language, in her gesture, or in her thinking. So the issue is not to eliminate religion. The issue is to get rid of the caricature, the malformation, those who speak on religion's behalf and who are uninformed, whose authority has become inauthentic because it contradicts its very heart. Well, this can be a bleak evening, right? Not simply because we had to listen to David, nor indeed because you're unaware of how long this is going to go. And it's not going much further. And we could, I suppose, given the talk, it's a tough time being God these days, to name it the St. Jerome Center for Nietzschean Experience. After all, the atheists are having their way with us. They have the spotlight. Even in last week's Sunday Star, the national bestseller list, slightly different than the earlier one that I put together, indicated that on the top 10 books, the first two, or the second and the fourth, once again Hitchens' book, God is Not Dead, and Dawkins' The God Delusion, Infidel was number 8, but number 9 was absolutely extraordinary. No, it wasn't Stalking the Holy. God knows I tried. It's Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light, by Brian Kolodachuk. And the reason why it got to the list is because of how the media handled it. It assumed that Mother Teresa had no faith. So in fact, she was a bit of a fraud all those 50 years because God was never her comfort. What that reflected, of course, is a profound ignorance of the apophatic way, the theology of God's absence, the negative way, the via negativa, just simply not even knowing that fundamental or axiomatic aspect of standard Christian spirituality could have easily led to people thinking that Mother Teresa did not taste God's presence for nearly 50 years. Now, what is interesting is the person who wrote the book is her postulator of the cause, because he understands how wonderful her life will resonate with ordinary folk so that they know it's quite legitimate to taste God's absence, to know despair, to wonder if God lives, not to know his love. So his argument is, look, Mother Teresa's like the rest of us. But for many of the reviewers it was, hey, look, Mother Teresa was an atheist. Furthest from the truth. There is also an interesting consolation. Professor Alan Jacob, in a mock consolatory advice, talking about the stark demographic fact that theists actually outproduce atheists. We might actually win in the end, according to the statisticians. He says, you know, as many studies have shown, atheism is especially associated with higher levels of education and with Western Europe. And highly educated people in Western Europeans tend to have low birth rates, less than replacement level in many cases. So if religious people are having lots of offspring and atheists aren't having many at all, that would suggest that it's almost impossible for atheists to gain ground, evolutionarily speaking. My hunch is that most, however, will find embracing humani vitae as an ideal response to a bold and cocksure atheism rather unpersuasive. And then, of course, there is The Simpsons. It appears that one quirky Anglican vicar has taken to pushing the theological sophistication of St. Bart as a way of countering the brazen proselytism of unbelief. He has even managed on his website, I understand, to have enlisted at least the sympathy of one of the finest minds in all of England, Rowan Williams, himself a long-standing devotee of Springfield, America's sweetly dysfunctional family. But he also happens to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. By way of conclusion, I've given you the context, the rage, the primary proponents of this, the diagnostic reality of religion's disarray, of its lack of any kind of credible luster, of the fact that people are either shamed by religion, fearful of its discussion, determined to eliminate it. The current debate about faith-based education in the province of Ontario is a perfect illustration, I think, of the extreme skittishness and fear that people have in talking about religion in the public forum, in large measure because the culture and the tone of the time has ill-disposed them to that kind of enlightened conversation. They're fearful. So it would be unfair of me, on the 25th anniversary, to end on an apocalyptic note, to suggest that by the next 25 years, there won't be a Centre for Catholic Experience, and that somehow or other, all we'll have are a series of urns up here of past directors, representing a past of mad heroism. I don't believe that, though. I don't believe it at all. And I'll tell you why. And here's my conclusion. The answer to the new aggressive atheism cannot be found in easy refutation, strategic retreat, self-righteous admonishments, delirious execrations, or noble silence. There is need for some common ground, for a language that speaks of the ineffable in ways that bespeaks the poetry and humility of genuine adoration. One of my favorite writers is a simple British priest, parish priest, except he's not simple. He's a poet and a diarist of near genius. His name is Daniel O'Leary. And here's what he says about Einstein, a way of entry into a more sane understanding of the ineffable. He said Einstein cherished a feeling of utter humility towards the unattainable secrets of the harmony of the cosmos. And Einstein saw himself before the mystery, as he put it, in the position of a little child, entering a huge library filled with books in many languages. Here we have the wonder of the mystics, the silence of the contemplatives, the new images of a sacramental vision. Fearful, fearful religion, adrift from its source, blocks out God's mystical flow in and through all things. It cannot cope with a God so big. And that's right. And that's not just a warning to scientists. That's far more a warning to people of faith. God is bigger than our systems. God is bigger than our doctrine, our formularies, our structures, our notion of God, either by analogy or in any other way. Once we recognize God's bigness, we recognize as a consequence our humility, and therefore the temptation for fanaticism, which is always built on the absolute assurance or certitude that I am right and you are wrong, and that the eradication of the other is the confirmation of my personal truth. That is a perversion of religion. That, in fact, is the primal blasphemy. Religious people do it to themselves more than any atheist could ever want to do. It isn't atheism in the end we fear. It's us, people of faith, who have either mutilated its meaning or have made it exclusive. In other words, we've made it a crutch for our fears. There must be peace and mutual respect among people of faith. I believe that Catholicism can lead by demonstrating institutionally and culturally a new readiness to forgo the need for an enemy. As Enzo Bianchi, the founder, prior, and layperson of the ecumenical monastery of Bosse in Italy, observes, and I quote, he's quite a remarkable figure. Started off as a psychologist. He quotes, "We began by demonizing non-believers, then believers of other religions. Then we were obliged to demonize non-Catholic Christians, and eventually those Catholics who do not think like us. The problem is that we Catholics have lived for many centuries with an enemy: modernity, the Enlightenment, secularism, and consumerism. And with the end of these ideologies, we want to have a new enemy. Instead, it is in dialogue that together we must find the paths toward humanization." End of quote. Now, what Bianchi says may be all rather naive, I know, like the madness of the holy ones, a bit like Chiara lubicine vocalarini, thinking that in a riven world where fervid ideologies are hell-bent on eliminating the opposition, the other, where the science of the mind admits no restraint, where the intoxicants of power and possession never lose their allure, where truth is held hostage to semantic legerdemain, and where the commodification of knowledge eclipses the growth of wisdom. In a world such as this, the person of faith must speak of that other science, the scientia cordis, the science of the heart. And I want to end now by referring briefly to three figures, two of whom were in this room, one of whom was never in this room, but may as well have been. The first, talking about the integrity of faith as a spiritual seeker, is Henry Nouwen. It's especially appropriate for me to be standing up here tonight and mentioning Henry, first of all, for several reasons. First of all, he opened the center with his lecture, The Spirituality of Peacemaking, 25 years ago this month. That's how the center opened. Secondly, he's had a long association with this university through his close friendship with the Chancellor of St. Jerome's University, Dr. Peter Kavanagh. They had met at Nijmegen when they were studying, and they retained a strong friendship over the years. Also, a new member of the Board of Governors of St. Jerome's University, Kevin Burns, a CBC producer and my producer, is working with me and Peter on a series on Henry Nouwen. But why Nouwen? And what could Nouwen provide that could provide us with some kind of trajectory or way through this mess? It's this. Henry Nouwen, in my view, appreciated the profound rootlessness of contemporary humanity, its deep spiritual displacement. He understood that everything in our culture that defines success or fulfillment is predicated precisely upon those qualities that work against our yearning for wholeness. We need to cultivate, in Nouwen's mind, both the discipline of solitude and the discipline of community. And we need to do this in order to move slowly, and I quote from him, from an absurd to an obedient life, from a life filled with noisy worries to a life in which there is some inner peace where we can listen to our God. A psychologist of the heart and of the soul, Nouwen wrote not only to guide others, but to discover himself. This exercise was rarely easy, and at one point, nothing short of personally catastrophic. As he once observed, and this is the perfect line of the spiritual seeker, as he once observed, and I quote, "One way to express the spiritual crisis of our time is to say that most of us have an address, but cannot be found there." Another important spiritual figure that can provide us with a way of direction out of this morass I was talking about was also here. His name, Donald Nicol. Donald was a graduate of Oxford, Balliol, in fact, taught for many years in the United States, came to Canada, took an early retirement from the university in order to become identified with the poor in Maggie Thatcher's England. So appalled by what he saw with the devastation of the north of England that he left his very comfortable life as a professor in California and returned to England to identify with the unemployed. He had come from a small mining village and was the first and only child ever to go to university, the first ever to have a fellowship to Oxford and to go to its most prestigious college at that. Donald became a spiritual seeker. Now, this is not a cheap word. Okay? I don't mean by this something either quasi-romantic or a soft-headed, a spiritual seeker, somebody who just goes out there and it's a kind of diversion at a certain point in one's life. No, I'm talking about this as being constitutive of the very way he's thought and the way he read and the way he related to people. He tried to understand everyone. Here's a wonderful passage from a book called The Beatitude of Truth. It was published just a few years before his death by cancer. And what he does here is define, I think, perfectly the spiritual seeker. He says, "It is clear that spiritual seekers are not content with examining merely the external features of other traditions or their statements of belief, but rather they penetrate to the very heart of them. They find that by that they get into the tradition itself, and they know why it lives. And they share in it without taking it upon themselves to make comparisons, knowing that no one can only compare what lies on the surface. They share in the worship and prayers, the pilgrimages and festivals. They rejoice with the others at their feasts, and they mourn with them at their funerals. One of the most moving accounts of such a quest is to be found in a work called The Hindu and Christian in Vrindavan by the German Catholic Klaus Klostermaier, who spent 2 years in Vrindavan, the playground of Krishna in India. The seeker, he says, and let me quote, will not want to have anything more to do with academic dalliance or a science of comparative religion, behaving as if it stood above all religions. He will also not want to know anything more of a certain kind of theology that works without presuppositions and pleases itself in manipulating definitions and formulas and forgets about the human, who is the main concern. He will be more and more pulled into what is called spirituality, the real life of the mind. I wanted to see a famous man in Benares, a sagacious philosopher feared by many as a merciless critic of Christian theology. I had my own reasons for paying him a visit. He was polite. He invited me to tea and then mounted the attack. I let him take his fill without saying a word myself. Then I began to talk about the things I had begun to understand within the dialogue, quite positively Christian. We got into a sincere, good, deep discussion. He had intended to send me away after 10 minutes. When I left after 2 hours, he had tears in his eyes. He says, if we insisted on our theologies, you as a Christian and I as a Hindu, we should be fighting each other. But we have found one another because we probed more deeply towards spirituality. End of quote. In the light of this statement, by Klostermaier, we catch a glimpse of how one might penetrate to the heart of other spiritual traditions and achieve what we call the scientia cordis, the science of the heart, on which all of them converge. They converge for the very good reason that they are all in contact, in one manner or another, with the very same reality. And the final one that I want to mention, just as I close, and I am now seriously thinking of closing. David, get the doors. Is Thomas Merton, a St. Jerome Center wannabe. 5 years of Merton seminars, countless Merton talks, Merton concerts, and Merton books. The place became a little Gethsemane unto itself. But in the end, Merton became, I think, and remains, the most interesting international spiritual seeker of the last century. And people are coming to him in large droves now, not because they need a model or a guru or an idol. That's always dangerous. And those who are academics in this room, of course, would be profoundly suspicious of them. We have this working hermeneutic of suspicion. We're very critical of anyone who defers to authority. We consider it a betrayal of the fundamental critical posture we should always take in relation to everything. And a properly educated person, of course, reflects that. But we also know that we look to people who embody in the integrity of their lives, where their thinking and their witness converge, powerful statements or witnesses of things that matter. Merton was one of those. And in a very early work, in the 50s, long before things became fashionable, Merton understood that in the end, it isn't ecclesiastical polity, it isn't fights over dogma, it isn't slaying by broadsword or scimitar, either literally or metaphorically. It's not the politicization of religion. It's not the taking over of the public arena and reducing it to some kind of millenarian thrust. None of these things speak to authentic religion. It is found rather in Newman's old wonderful phrase, cor ad cor loquitur, heart talking to heart. He understood this as the primordial wisdom, and so he could say, in as strange and peculiar way as it is, a way more for the poet than it is perhaps the systematician, but nonetheless with this resonating kernel of truth that I think speaks to the perduring value of this centre. He said, Merton, that in order to be genuinely Catholic, he, a Cistercian monk, he must exclude nothing, and he must include all. He said, the more I am able to affirm others, to say yes to them in myself, by discovering them in myself and myself in them, the more real I am. I am fully real if my own heart says yes to everyone. I will be a better Catholic, not if I can refute every shade of Protestantism, but if I can affirm the truth in it. So too with Islam, and with Hinduism, and with Buddhism. This doesn't mean syncretism, indifferentism, the vapid and careless friendliness that accepts everything by thinking of nothing, no. There is much that one cannot affirm and accept, but first one must say yes, where one really can. If I affirm myself as a Roman Catholic merely by denying all that is Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., in the end, I will find that there is not much left for me to affirm as a Catholic, and certainly no breath of the Spirit with which to affirm it. End of quote. The only true antidote to the fanaticism that surrounds us, either inspired by those who do not understand religion or by those who would eliminate it, is found in these simple statements by these profound spiritual seekers. I think that the role of the centre here in Waterloo, and indeed in Southern Ontario, has been a wonderful example of the university's accepting its responsibility to provide a context or an outreach for the discussion of matters of great consequence. What really strikes me even now from a distance as still true is that people come together not to say no to each other, but to say yes first of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Michael has agreed to take questions for about 15 or 20 minutes. And if you have a question, I would ask that you make your way to the mics that are on either side of the room. So, off to your left, we have a question.
Yes, hi. I'm a non-theist, or as I prefer to call it, a member of the loyal opposition. It seems like since the center is so concerned with social justice, I wish a little effort had been devoted to liberating the non-theists among us, since we've been downtrodden for so long. But my question is, I recently read a statement by a fundamentalist who was trying to argue against evolution. And he said, the evolutionary biologists say things like, Charles Darwin said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And it struck me that theists, when they want to denigrate atheists or science in general as not providing any answers, they often choose explicitly religious language because, of course, the real saying is Jesus said it, I believe it, and that settles it, and you can actually see that on bumper stickers throughout the southern U.S. And you did it too. You referred to evangelical atheists, which, of course, always gets a good laugh. So my question is, why is it when theists want to denigrate atheists or scientists that they choose explicitly religious terminology to do so?
Very interesting question. I'm not sure that I think that they do. Roger Scruton's observation about evangelical atheists, and he was the one I was quoting, he's a philosopher, I think it was based primarily on the assumption that any particular passion, fervor, or proselytizing energy could be attached to anyone. I think that that's what he was thinking. I don't think it was an effort specifically to denigrate anyone who held a well-considered atheistic position. It's not so much the debate with atheism that seems to me largely the problem. What is the debate is around actually perceptions or caricatures of atheists as much as it is perceptions or caricatures of theists. Theists don't tend to define themselves as theists. any more than deists do as deists. That's a peculiar nomenclature. It seems to me quite arcane. I think people define it in somewhat different terms, and partly particularly for people of faith, and at least increasingly so, it's defined in relational terms, and not simply in terms of either dogma or metaphysics or some kind of ontological argument, the value of which, of course, still is not can't be gainsaid, but is not the kind of thing that is engaged in the public with any kind of continuing fervor. The difficulty comes, in my view, not with the failure to respond to charges of religion's inadequacy to be sufficiently grounded in rational argumentation. What is disturbing about the new and aggressive atheistic thrust is not that at all to me, because atheists have been around for a great period of time, always will be, and should be rightfully respected. It is the undertone, and it is the kind of language that speaks of religion as poison that is perhaps most distressing. And it is the marketing of that venom which doesn't contribute in any way to enlightened conversation. It's very difficult to sit down with somebody and to say, I respect your position, but I know that what you think I do is in fact poisonous, and that I'm contributing actually to the dissolution and bifurcation of society by transmitting or passing on values that you consider not only personally ridiculous, but indeed abhorrent and threatening to social peace. That really does change the dialogue considerably.
We could have this conversation, which we otherwise wouldn't do. So I think that Hitchens, Dawkins, Dennett, and so forth deserve a lot of credit because they've actually made it possible for people who were afraid to admit in public. For example, Representative Pete Stark yesterday was the first representative of the U.S. Congress ever, in my knowledge, to admit that he didn't believe in God. It's opened up a space where people can say that and not be ashamed. So that is rhetoric aside, and actually I agree with a lot of that rhetoric. I think it's opened up that space.
Yes, I think the difficulty when dealing with Hitchens, of course, in particular, is that not that the result that you're referring to hasn't occurred. It has in fact occurred, and if it has allowed people to have the freedom to be able to come out of the atheistic closet, if you like, that's good. That is in fact very good. Atheists shouldn't be in the closet, but then neither should people of faith. And the difficulty is with Hitchens' rhetoric is that it has become, I think, over the years, and I quite like him, I read his stuff fairly often, I've interviewed him for the CBC, is that a good part of this is in fact theater, but some of it does suggest, especially in its more vituperative form, a little unhinged sensibility. I'm actually rather disturbed by the latest work. But anyway, that's just a private opinion.
The meeting of the minds at the deeper level that you mentioned towards the end of your talk, I applaud that. I think one of the problems has been that we, people of faith, when we forget about reason at all, then we send out messages to the external world that we really can do whatever in the name of faith. And your suggestion that there should be understanding at the core level, core spirituality level, amongst ourselves, to send out good messages outside that we, people of faith, can do some real good in this world. Not that we have not been doing that in the past, but we can do much better, in my opinion. Maslow in 1964 suggested that religions should get together and teach courses on core spirituality of all religions. And I think he made a very good suggestion. And you tend to agree with that. I don't know whether you know about Maslow's suggestion or not, But that understanding at the deep level of human spirituality, I think there lies the key. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Look at I mentioned her briefly earlier on, Chiara Lubitsch, but similarly you look at the writings of Jean Vanier. I think what you discover is that it isn't driven by any kind of specific orthodoxy. It's driven by a very deep desire to achieve a level of communion, and a communion that actually transcends creed and everything else. Now, again, this sounds rather fanciful, but it's not when you actually look at lives that are lived that way. Bede Griffiths, for instance, who lived in an ashram in India for many years. He was a Benedictine who had been converted by C.S. Lewis, actually, and Tolkien while he was at Oxford, and went on to live his life. William Johnson did the same in Japan. And what they do is they come into contact with a living culture, and that living culture intensifies their understanding of the faith that lives within them. And so growth in faith is growth in this yes to the other, not in the no to the other. What disturbs me about the recent poisoning environment and all its implications from both within and from without is that no one is attending to that yes, to that need for communion. There is just a profound effort to bring in the proverbial tanks, if it were, or to raise the drawbridge, and really to secure religion as a citadel over against post-modernity, new scientific challenges, the discomfort that sometimes comes with a multi-faith society where you don't have that kind of homogenized feeling or culture that you feel best suited to. All these things constitute fear. But religion doesn't thrive in fear. It's perverted by fear. And this goes back to Bianchi's earlier point, I think, about realizing that religion must disown its own natural tendency to demonize, to find an enemy. What is true of religion, of course, is also true of politics, and is true of ordinary human relations. But when it involves the divinity, it tends to have implications far more ruinous in the aggregate than if it was just a single individual.
David?
Yes, Michael, I liked your talks, the parts I didn't nap through. I was a little surprised or wondering why, when discussing the new atheists, you didn't mention it's an overtired theme, I know, but 9/11 and the war on terrorism, surely that provides the inspiration for and the context for this new atheism and its new aggressiveness. I wonder if you would say something about it.
Thank you for that. I alluded to it briefly, but I didn't go into it in any depth. I just in the form of a line, partly because I didn't want to go in that direction. But you're absolutely quite right. And let me put it in a slightly larger context, because David's question is the best question he's asked in 35 years. You have no idea what he asked in grade 11. I would lose my license to teach if you ever heard. But I remember I wrote a book in 2000 called The Muted Voice, Religion and the Media. And it was based on a series of lectures that I gave in 1998 at Mount St. Vincent University School of Communications in Halifax. And one of the things that I had been observing over in the recent years, largely because of the emergence of Conrad Black, but also several other things, that religion was beginning to get a measure of important reportage coverage. People were taking seriously. And I don't mean, again, looking at it, giving it a necessarily positive spin or anything, but taking religion seriously as a component, social, political, and cultural of our society. And not just one religion, every religion. And you could even get things that you've never seen before. Under William Thorsell, the Globe and Mail, for all intents and purposes, eliminated religion from these pages. It's only when Richard Addis came in. The only reason why Richard Addis came in was largely because the publisher of the Globe saw, with the success of the National Post, that by beefing up and by actually assigning specifically reporters to deal with religious matters, it actually had a significant following. CTV, for the first time in its history, appointed somebody to work in religion. CBC increased its religious coverage and beyond the sparse number of programs that were available. And all of a sudden, it was as if permission was given to talk about these things. And you have a wonderful example of our Foreign Affairs Minister at the time, Lloyd Axworthy, actually saying in the Globe and Mail, after Richard Ellis has been appointed, he was being interviewed and he was talking about, and this refers very specifically to the earlier point about social justice, he was talking about his work with landmines and everything else, and he said, this comes from my vocation, as a United Church person brought up in the social gospel tradition of the prairies. Okay? And later on, Mike Harcourt, after he had fallen in British Columbia and nearly died, and he talked specifically about his own spirituality as being restorative. In other words, there was permission in the media to give religion the kind of space, if you like, that you would give sports or the business coverage or the latest murder. In other words, it had a place as a matter of human interest and behavior. And then 9/11 happened. And it all disappeared. The coverage all immediately became highly politicized. It became almost exclusively negative. People became deeply fearful. There are now several newspapers across the country that have actually eliminated the faith page. David earlier on alluded to the fact that I have a column in the Toronto Star. Well, I did for 20 years. I don't anymore. That section, for all intents and purposes, being weeded out. Fortunately, one of my fellow graduate students I taught with, David, is now writing regularly on environment and religion for them, Stephen Sharper, who will be here as part of your series later on. But the Kitchener-Waterloo Record is one of the few newspapers actually in the country that has a deliberately set-aside faith page. The Toronto Star, I fought with Giles Gerson at this at one point, because his argument was we should get religion into the larger coverage. It should be in social coverage, political coverage. I agreed entirely. I think that's where it should be. I don't think it should be a specific faith page, isolating it as if it were some kind of diversion or minor interest. It should be there where the action is. The problem is, and I was warned about this, is that in fact, it doesn't happen. They say they're going to move it away, and it will give it more coverage by assigning others. In fact, it kind of disappears. I attribute a great deal of this, actually, to the reign of terror that exists in people's hearts and minds since 9/11. Their anxiety about all forms of jihadism, their fear of the specter of religion suddenly breaking out in any kind of crusade, and this, again, is not unique or particular to any one religion. It could be any religion. Certainly Christianity takes a fair hit on this. But it is the very fear about talking about religion. And that accounts in some measure for people moving to talk about spirituality because they find that safer ground. It's more neutral ground to talk about spirituality than it is to talk about religion. The danger in that in the long run is impoverishment, because a spirituality not grounded in an organic religious tradition with its cultus and its rituals and its communitarian sense in its history will eventually dissipate in the hands of passing individualism. So spirituality itself has, the great traditions, the Kabbalah, the Hasidim, the Carmelites, the Sufi, all the great religious traditions have, with their marvelous spiritual movements, have been grounded in something. It's not just simply been, this is my private property. So for me, the shift to spirituality is neutral ground, and the avoidance of religion in all its iterations is not a happy development. And this is the environment we live in now, and I don't know for how much longer.
Thank you, Michael. Please join me in thanking Michael. I've asked Dave Perrin, our new president and vice chancellor at St. Jerome's, to provide the official thank you. Secretly, I also invited David because I wanted to be the tallest person on stage tonight. So, Dave, please come and give thanks.
Well, it certainly is my pleasure to thank you, Dr. Higgins, on behalf of the Center and its 25th anniversary year. What a privilege it is to have you this night to celebrate such a special moment. And I would like to congratulate and also thank all the directors that are here present tonight, that have made such a wonderful effort to be here and to celebrate with us and to mark this wonderful occasion. I just wanted to mention also Dr. Higgins. I believe that we have a third reason why Henri Nouwen is very much present in this room tonight. You mentioned two reasons. I believe there's a third. And it was Dr. Naus that mentioned earlier that this evening, today, is the anniversary of Henri Nouwen's death. 1996, I believe, and that's today. And that today is our 25th anniversary. So we just hold that coincidence, if you believe in such things, as part of the spirit of tonight's gathering, that the spirit of Henri Nouwen is very much alive and with us through these kinds of exchanges and these kinds of moments. And so let us just recall that. So certainly, Michael, you have reminded us of the spirit with which the center was launched 25 years ago, and you are part of that legacy, and for that we give thanks. You have certainly helped us understand what is happening in our culture, in our politics, in our churches, and I think also you have helped us understand what might be happening in our own lives, in our own hearts. We ought not to think that the situations which Dr. Higgins referred to are out there somewhere, but they are within perhaps our own relationships that we need to pay heed to. You have helped us understand the zany and the humorous situation which we find ourselves in, from the wild to the ludicrous. You've helped us understand God's bad luck today, but our good luck is having you with us, Dr. Higgins. You've shown us the complexity of the situation, the many angles to this prism, and this prism we call religion. You have argued well that the forces and arguments against belief are truly without foundation, that they themselves are indeed poisonous. You showed us that there is hope in simple ways, the most basic ways. In our commitment to humility, to community, we recognize the face of the other in the genuine spirit, the face of the other, as developed by such philosophers as Levinas. And so thank you for being here with us, for taking the time. Your energy and your talent has not been lost upon us, I think, as the appreciative applause has shown. So congratulations, and we look forward to a continued relationship with you.
Just two final reminders. One is, on your way out, please give Carol Person a nod, thanking her for putting this evening together. Without Carol's work basically administering the center, we would not have these events. Also, Ivan Person in sound, as well as the IT department here at St. Jerome's have provided ample hearing, I hope. Also, I'd like to remind you that we do have a lecture on October 19th. John Bentley Mays, a writer with the Catholic Register and a writer with a column in the Globe and Mail, will be here speaking on the creative city, the future of Christian urbanism. I know Michael knows John quite well, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until next time, David's reminding me. So, okay, here you go. I'm the new director. Trying to direct directors is impossible. I apparently forgot something the director should never forget. There is a free will offering that you may make, and there is a bucket at the back, and you may make checks out to St. Jerome's. You can give those to Carol on your way out as you thank her for this evening. Thank you. Until next time, God bless.